Real quick, before we start with the gameplay, I do want to address something I feel like would be in the comments of this video in particular. I know I don't have the best execution in these games, especially with Wuthering Waves, and so far it doesn't seem like people are taking that as a reason to say that I don't know what I'm talking about. But I feel like with this topic in particular, that might become the sentiment. So I'd hope that what I'm saying about the topic can express my understanding of it in a way that my boomer reflexes perhaps aren't as good at doing. Thank you very much for understanding. Now let's get to the actual video. When I talked about the potential of Zany power creeping other characters in the game Wuthering Waves, one recurring theme in the comments is that, well, quite frankly, I was wrong about the numbers, or I guess slightly more accurately to the way I interpreted it, because I was specifically looking at the theoretical numbers instead of taking execution difficulty into account. I defended myself on that in the comments, and their criticism is correct, but not really what my point was. That being others whose first line of defense against calling Zany power creep wasn't to bring up execution difficulty, but rather to say that you can beat the content without her just fine, specifically to point out the hypocrisy in saying that as a defense when it is a criticism given to pretty much every Hoyoverse game. However, in speaking on the matter, a few things about skill expression in these types of games came up, and I thought it'd be interesting to delve a little bit more into that side of it. And look, I know some of you are waiting for a different update. That's coming, but the more that shit evolves, the longer that's gonna take, okay? So first thing I want to do is establish a bit of terminology in relation to skill expression that's pretty relevant to this discussion in particular. As I said, most people were saying the damage was about the same between Zany and other units because of the execution mastery required to execute the theoretical maximum calculated by places like Pridewind not being realistic, which, I mean, to be fair, you see this kind of thing in speedrunning all the time, where there's shortcuts that require a level of skill that seems unreasonable for a human to be able to perform consistently, at least until tons of practice or a discovery of a new method makes that execution more viable. I'm not saying that kind of discovery will ever happen with Zany. You can't really assume that it's going to happen, but I bring that up to say that what the calculations of the theoretical maximum show is part of a character's power level, that part being the skill ceiling, or basically how good it is possible to be. Part of the reason so many people seem to think that Zany being power creep is simply because of a confusion of the skill ceiling with the overall power level. A character that's more powerful but requires more skill to access that power, in other words, has a higher skill ceiling, is more likely to be properly balanced. Although, admittedly, if there's a trend of characters getting bigger theoretical numbers, even with each increasing the skill ceiling, you may have a game design problem of a different sort on your hands. And look, I don't normally like showing these comments because that's not the point, but one statement gave the firm belief that the potential of a character should be higher if the skill ceiling is higher, which, I mean, yeah, that's kind of what the term means in the first place. But I can see why people may be a little bit confused, because while the terms skill ceiling and skill floor are pretty related and sound related, they're actually measuring very different things. While the skill ceiling is more so a measure of a character's potential, the skill floor is a measure of how much skill it takes to be competent. Or, in other words, how accessible a character is from a gameplay standpoint. Interestingly enough, even though the skill floor is probably the more complex term in relation to what it means, it actually takes a lot less time to explain it, which actually could be considered an example of that relationship in and of itself. But let me provide a Genshin Impact example instead of going on a meta-narrative. And one that I've used before, actually. Hu Tao and Arlecchino. These two characters, for the most part, do the same thing. Another difference between them that I haven't brought up before, though, is that Arlecchino's skill floor is actually much lower than Hu Tao's. There's an entire dash cancel and jump cancel pattern to consider with Hu Tao due to relying on charge attacks, more stamina management on the part of the Hu Tao player as well, and you have to dodge more effectively because Hu Tao wants your actual health to be low, while Arlecchino uses a different mechanic that serves a similar health draining function. So you have more room for error to get hit with Arlecchino. There's actually a relationship between skill floor and skill ceiling that can help identify something as being or not being power creep as well. For example, in the Hu Tao and Arlecchino example, I pointed out how Arlecchino is a power-crept Hu Tao, and one of the primary reasons this is hard to argue against is because of that lowered skill floor on the newer unit. Even if you feel that Arlecchino's skill ceiling is a about the same as Hu Tao's, the skill floor being the only difference means that being competent is easier, thus providing you quicker access to learning more advanced aspects of the characters to become better more quickly. And yes, a skill ceiling being higher when the skill floor is the same, like Zany, can be an issue of power creep as well. Often less direct, and it takes a pattern of continuing to do so for it to be a problem. Not to mention being a problem that's obfuscated by the fact that requiring better execution to be better factors into the equation. Of course, both in the comments and elsewhere on the internet for that matter, the argument gets made against Genshin that it has far less skill expression than Wuthering Waves. But the definition of what skill expression is tends to be a little bit inconsistent, especially when it comes down to a primarily single-player experience. But I'm gonna try and provide something here, so bear with me if this doesn't match up with your personal definition. The amount of skill expression that a game has could be best defined as the difference between the skills of a player and the skill floor and a player who is at the skill ceiling. To put it another way, it's how big the skill room is. Part of the reason I feel this phrase gets used inconsistently, especially with Gacha, is because it tends to be used interchangeably with the skill floor, even though a game can have more skillfully expressive elements that are less required to be considered optional. It's under these conditions that most say that Genshin Impact has less skill expression than Wuthering Waves, but I would like to, well, expand on that more from the perspective that I come into it seeing. Now, personally, I believe the people who talk about Genshin having no skill expression are the ones that are most likely conflating the forward level with the size of the whole room, because Genshin does have advanced mechanics to delve into. I brought up Hu Tao before, but there are several other characters that have the ability to cancel a longer basic attack animation near the end in order to save time. Notable examples that I've personally practiced doing this with being Zhongli and Razor. Anybody else remember dragon diving? You know, where certain enemies, you can actually dash jump off of them to be able to perform a low altitude plunging attack that does high altitude damage, primarily with Claymore characters and especially with taller Claymore characters. Razor's a character that is supposed to be incredibly difficult to do this with, but you know, here I was trying to learn it with a character that shouldn't be able to make it work. Some of these same people want to say that the elemental reaction system in Genshin weakens skill expression by just asking you to mix the colors together. But some of the same people will complain about having to do complex calculations in order to operate that system, which is another aspect of this that isn't really taken into consideration. Most people who talk about skill expression being lacking in Genshin more so use that to mean that the skills they want to express aren't the skills that Genshin has depth in executing. While there's a few characters that do some kind of parry, the main two that have one that come to mind, interestingly enough, being 4-star characters, Wuthering Waves has both dodging and parrying attacks as universal mechanics. Not only that, but Wuthering Waves actually tends to give you more feedback in relation to dodging and parrying, with visual and audible indicators that you dodged or parried successfully, not to mention how doing so builds up your concerto. That actually brings me to one of the most interesting aspects of the comments about Genshin having less skill expression than Wuthering Waves. By their own definition, they are correct, even if I don't agree with the definition that they give. By my definition, I also think they're correct, although there's more skill expression in Genshin than some are willing to let on, and the skills expressed just aren't the ones that they want to express. And there's plenty of reasons that gap feels wider, the amount of feedback for well-executed maneuvers being just part of the equation. Perhaps one of the bigger places where the gap is felt is something I was talking about with Night Soul doing too overtly, making character choice matter to a more restrictive degree, rather than to an expressive degree. Like, Genshin's most recent boss, you've been seeing some of the gameplay of it. It basically requires you to have constant cryo application or get obliterated midway through the fight. But I can fight the Dragon of Dirge with solo Brant if I really want to, and I'm just talking about, you know, the farming level up materials versions of these, no hologram or abyss or anything like that. Now, to be fair, it is technically possible to dodge every single one of the boss's lasers when it starts spinning if you get good enough at the timing. So technically you could just say the skill floor for this boss is very high and gets lowered by way of using cryo against it. Okay, cool, that's great. That's still a really high floor to be justifying it this way. For me, this is actually one of the most interesting things that can happen with these videos. When someone says something where I wind up agreeing with the overall point, but don't necessarily agree with the reasoning, because that creates a lot more of a discussion on where people have common ground and where they differ. I love conversations like that, and some people have been very willing to engage that kind of conversation, whether you're complaining about me shit-talking Genshin, or you're complaining about me shit-talking Wuwa. And hey, I don't know how quick the Etheria restart slander is going to start on this channel, but I'm willing to let you know right now that I'm gonna play it, so it's probably coming. But for now, what do you think? Do you think that Genshin has too low of a skill floor? Does Wuthering Waves' skill ceiling intimidate you? Let me know how low my skill expression is in the comments. I tried to warn you at the beginning that it would be cringe, and be sure to leave a like on your way out. But until next time, this is the effing Boonslayer, signing out. How have the videos continued to be, like, just 10 minutes? Barely. This is 4 pages, by the way. This should be 12. I thought it was going to be 12. Oh well.